Welcome to our webinar on for Oxford Social Finance Program on how we create a low carbon economy through social finance. This is again a part of our series on educational series on how creative social finance tools are used around the world. We're excited about bringing together today some colleagues from Canada to really talk about what they're doing in the context of creating a low carbon economy using social finance strategies. I'm joined today by colleagues Bruce Laurie, who's the president and CEO of Ivey Foundation, Stephen Huddard, who's also CEO of J.W. McConnell Foundation, and Arlene Strom, who's the Vice President of Sustainability and Communications of Suncor Energy. All of these panelists are also joining us as faculty members in our Oxford Social Finance Program starting in November. So I want to welcome them, and we're going to hear from them their perspective on why Canada's role in social finance and climate is so essential, especially given the changing political dynamics in North America, with the U.S. Bowing out, unfortunately, of the Climate Accord, Paris Accord. The opportunity for Canada to become a global leader in North America and around the world in its strategies and its partnerships is what we're going to explore today. So with that, I'll continue. Next slide, Brad. The conversation questions that we'll be addressing in the webinar, again, what makes Canada's work in creating a low carbon economy so important globally? How do you build very effective collaborations, and what do you do in terms of maintaining and aligning those collaborations? As you see that Ivey and McConnell Foundation are working with Suncor Energy Foundation, unique partners offering unique skills. How do you build the capacity of business and the financial institutions to bring into the mix resources associated with social change and climate change? And how do you ensure a critical voice of First Nations people who are hard hit by climate change into economic opportunities and social change and social finance? As we've merged these relationships, what are we learning about leadership and negotiation? And also I've asked our colleagues to talk in their presentation about what they'd like students to offer them in terms of our global marketplace and our global audience for social finance. What they'd like to learn. It's a very experiential process that we use during Oxford Social Finance Program, taking solutions to scale, and it's iterative. So our students will also offer their skills in helping Canada find new solutions. So next slide. With that, I'd like to introduce and welcome Bruce Laurie, who's going to be our first speaker. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Gayle. I appreciate that. I just thought I would start with a little bit of context and history of where we've come from in Canada and why we think Canada is a particularly interesting case study to look at from the perspective of the role of philanthropy and social finance in major systems change. And if you can just switch my slide ahead, or am I able to do that? Great, thanks. So, I mean, if you step back and just look at where Canada's come from over the last, say, 3 decades, we had roughly a decade of leadership under the federal Liberal government that basically said, it sort of acknowledged that climate and environment were a problem, but if you imagine the country, say, as a big ship, a big oil tanker, they basically acknowledged there was an issue and cut the engines and let this big ship float around, hoping nobody would notice. Well, after about 10 years, people started to notice. We got a new government, a conservative government, and they came in basically saying, well, climate might be a problem, but it's not a big enough problem. Jobs are the issue. We're gonna put this ship full steam ahead for a fossil fuel economy, and that's where we were for about 10 or 12 years, up until a couple of years ago, when we got a new government that then decided, okay, we're going to try to turn this ship around. we need instead to be focusing on a fossil economy. We really need to be figuring out how do we move to a low carbon sustainable economy. And the challenge was, I can sort of imagine, you know, using this analogy, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau saying, okay, well, we need to, you know, set our new course, you know, navigator, set a new course. And guess what? There's no navigator. Well, let's just look at the navigation tools. Well, we have no navigation tools. Well, let's just rev the engines up. Well, guess what? We have no fuel. So the capacity, the institutions, everything we needed to try to turn this ship around in Canada either never existed, or if they did exist, they were very, very significantly contracted over the last 20 years or the previous 20 years of these governments. So the challenge for philanthropy really is, when we're looking at this intersection of economy and environment, recognizing that these are complex issues requiring systemic change, is that we really need to have new players, new ideas, and new approaches to solving these challenges. And so for us, this meant really stepping back fundamentally and trying to understand, what does that mean in a Canadian context, and really what does that mean in terms of how we question. And these are the questions that I will have for the students in Oxford, and what I'm really hoping to learn from a global community in Oxford is, what can we learn about these global trends, whether it's trends about populism, trends about the lack of corporate, you know, really corporate influence in civil society, the need for social license, the role of civil society organizations and whether they're adapting and keeping up to the kinds of changes that we need. So if you can just move ahead with our slides, and I'll go quickly through the rest of these. Essentially, we see this opportunity now to look at Canada as a case study around the kinds of broad-based systems change that we're looking at. And we're essentially talking about taking one of the most, if not the most, carbon-intensive economies in the world and shifting to one that is less carbon-intensive and more sustainable. And we recognize that we need, as I said, to create new kinds of institutions. Ivey, Suncor, and McConnell were all active in helping create something called the Fiscal Commission, which is had tremendous influence in Canada and will be talked about at the course, and many other new kinds of partnerships that we'll hear about. If you can just move forward, thanks. To the next slide. So from the perspective of the Ivey Foundation, we've stepped back, done an assessment of the problem, which is really, you know, to reemphasize is this need for new institutional support. We've recognized that if we're going to make this kind of change, that the solution has to be, you know, research-based and policy-focused. And much of our work is through granting, but also through rethinking social finance, new opportunities around convening and leadership. And if we do this, our goal, the ultimate impact, is seeing these changes in systems that are reflected in a more sustainable economy in Canada. And next slide, please. So one example of what we've done that's, I think, quite creative, and again, Suncor and McConnell are participating in, along with a dozen other foundations, is a new philanthropic collaborative that is designed to aggregate the investments of foundations that see this challenge in Canada. And it's really, I would say, quite an innovative sort of, whether, you know, social finance, philanthropic finance mechanism that is looking at a 5 to 10 year time horizon, doing due diligence on strategically aligned high impact projects, figuring out the new kinds of capacity that we need, and using new finance mechanisms to get us there. And this group collectively has just recognized that doing more work on sustainable finance and social finance is one of the priorities for Canada, because if we can't align our financial system to these problems, we're not going to get to the solutions we need. And next slide, please. I've mentioned a number of these things, but just looking at the the specifics of the kinds of new capacity we need and activities that are underway right now, it is around pricing externalities, aligning public and private finance, looking at our infrastructure spending, the role of the clean tech industry, procurement and industrial policy, and creating a more energy efficient economy. So just a few examples of very specific initiatives that are underway. And the next slide, please. It's an example of some of the work that we're doing with the federal government to look at what kind of new institutional capacity do we need at a federal level. And the next slide, please. And then ultimately for us, these are some of the questions that we're hoping to pursue through the program at Oxford, and which we're hoping to hear more about today, which ultimately is, and I think really for me, question 4 is one of the critical ones. Have we been able to engage sufficient mainstream support? Are the naysayers behind us? And if not, why? And how do we ultimately mitigate what we're seeing as a global populist backlash to evidence-based policymaking and creative economic thinking? And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Gayle, for that introduction. Like Bruce, I wanted to just start with to give you a sense of why Suncor is engaged in this conversation and who we are. We are Canada's largest integrated energy company, and although we have assets in the North Sea and on the east coast of Canada and in renewables in Canada, we are primarily an oil sands producer, and that combination of assets makes us the 5th largest energy producer in North America. And so you can see by the size of our investment in this sector, we are heavily invested that we have a meaningful role in addressing a transition to a low carbon economy. If you can move to the next slide, please. From a macro point of view, I mean, and we saw a bit of this in Bruce's presentation too. I mean, we are operating in a world where there are many forces that seek to divide and polarize the conversation. And whether it's the political forces that are at play that sometimes make climate a wedge issue, or whether it's structural changes in the energy supply, primarily driven by shale oil and shale gas in the U.S., or the dynamic environment that we have greening the grid across North America. And it's, of course, the highly dynamic and fluid conversation around pipelines. So, compounding all of that complex and ambiguous environment, we have, a lack of trust with big institutional leaders, whether it's government or big business. And so I think with all of these factors, we are more than ever committed to continuing to collaborate and problem solve on some of these big issues like climate. We know we need to do our share in addressing climate change, but we know it also has to be a collaborative problem solving effort. Perhaps you can just move to the next slide, please. So, that's the environment that we work in. This is just a picture of a moment in time that was really a culmination of, I would say, a 20-year journey where we were committed to engaging with not only our critics, but with First Nations and with our peers in the energy sectors and with governments, whatever their political stripe. This is a picture from November 22nd in 2015, when you saw 5 environmental executive director leaders standing with 4 of the largest oil sands companies and their CEOs, the Premier, the Minister of the Environment, and Regional Chief Tony Alexis, and it was announcing Alberta's climate leadership plan. So this was, as I say, really the culmination of leadership in collaboration. And it's a hard process. It takes, we realize that it's something that is a long-term commitment. We have examples of 15 or 20 years ago where we would have Greenpeace come and set up a booth at our annual general meeting so that they could tell our shareholders about concerns they had with the project. But we have always felt that that's been an important part of actually finding solutions. It also means we don't necessarily get everything we want, but that we are able to develop better solutions that address the interests of many stakeholders. And I think one of the things that makes Canada unique is this environment where we are operating in a world where we have, many generations, 1,000-year-plus history of First Nations. There are 633 First Nations in Canada. So this is another factor that makes us unique. If you can go to the next slide, please. We have been, this is just to give you a quick snapshot, and I want you to, we have been working in this leadership space on being a leader in sustainable development for over 20 years. Our first climate plan was actually, we're celebrating our 20-year anniversary of our first climate plan. And that sort of culminated in some of the things that Bruce talked about. We've been working with other foundations. We're here together today to continue that partnership. But Ecofiscal was a partnership that, as Bruce said, had significant impact on the policy conversation in Canada. And with that first report of the Ecofiscal Commission calling for a carbon price, we renewed our position to call for a national price on carbon and supported the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan. But it's not all environment. I also want to reinforce that we are absolutely committed to the social side of this too. And when we look at leadership and sustainable development, I mean, one of my favorite definitions of leadership is one by Marshall Gans at Harvard. It's about enabling others to achieve purpose in conditions of uncertainty. And we've certainly seen that we operate in this dynamic world in conditions of great uncertainty and ambiguity. And so part of how we see that enabling of purpose or achieving leadership in sustainable development is creating conditions to be carbon and cost competitive, to lead not only in policy advocacy, but environmental and social performance. And we also think then that setting goals and having ambition that's clear in these areas is a really important part of leadership. If you go to the next slide, I'll just talk briefly about our social goal. We actually developed, we've had long-term environmental goals for some time, but until last year, we had never set a specific public target with respect to our social performance. And so last year, we set a social goal that was focused around strengthening our relationships with Aboriginal peoples. And we specifically took ownership and said, we need to change the way we think and act. And that requires a difference in our behavior. So we set specific targets that would help us measure our performance in improving our relationships with Aboriginal peoples. And they were around, deepening our own level of understanding of what reconciliation meant for us. It's partnering with Aboriginal youth. And then specifically looking at how Aboriginal employees see working at Suncor. So through not only hiring, but retention and advancement of Aboriginal employees. We started an Aboriginal employee network, which has given Aboriginal employees a safe space to come together and share their experiences. And then, of course, increasing revenues to Aboriginal business. And this is, when we look at social finance, in part, we've really focused on economic reconciliation. The picture you see there is our president of our upstream business with Chief Boucher, who's chief of one of the significant communities in the area that we operate. And it was marking the celebration of entering into a $500 million equity partnership agreement with 2 First Nations. And these are the kinds of agreements that we think are game-changing in terms of having mutually beneficial arrangements with First Nations, And we also have a partnership on a wind farm in Ontario with the Aamjiwnaang First Nation. So those are some of the ways that we're looking at that social finance world in terms of economic reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples. So maybe I'll pause there for now and turn it back to you, Gayle.
Muted.
Hello?
Hello, Gayle, can you hear us? Gayle, can you unmute yourself on your end?
Thank you, Brad. I'm unmuted now. And for those of you who come to the classroom, you'll know that I'm very unmuted during class. So thank you, Arlene, I appreciate that. Stephen, you've joined us. I want to bring you into the conversation. Again, Stephen is the President CEO of McConnell Foundation and has really set the stage for helping define social finance in Canada, particularly around social justice, climate change solutions. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. And then after Stephen's finished, we'll have a conversation among the panel and open the conversation up to the audience. We'd like to hear questions from you. And this is, again, an interactive process. But let's hear from Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Gayle. Hello, everyone. I'm with the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation in Montreal, and I'm going to talk today about our work in growing this social finance marketplace. And I'm going to use a very specific case study to illustrate how we can, I think, make a link between the work that has been referred to by my colleagues about integrating social perspectives into the environmental question and the finance question so as to achieve transformative change. So if we could go to my next slide. So we're basically, as a philanthropic organization, integrating our granting, our impact investing, and our whole portfolio approach, we call responsible investing, to grow the social innovation and social finance marketplace. This is all about taking initiatives and scaling them up to achieve systemic transformation. So right now we have a $50 million impact portfolio and we're growing that all the time. If we go to the next slide, you'll see some of the areas that we're invested in. And of course, environment and energy are part of this story, but so are all of these other places where, as a society, we believe transformation is taking place and that where we can invest in it. So this is important, I think, to understanding the social context of the transition to a low carbon economy is that it is requiring us to look at issues around food, access to health, the sharing of the tools for social entrepreneurship, and so on. And of course, down on the right there, you see Indigenous issues, which are really central to today's discussion. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about one of the companies that we're investing in and working with called Ivey Energy. It's an Indigenous-owned company, a social enterprise that is in the business of converting diesel-fueled power systems in remote communities. We're talking about diesel that is either delivered during winter on winter roads that are impassable during summer, or is in some cases flown in. Imagine flying barrels of diesel oil across the north to small communities to power their local power systems, their school, their lighting, home lighting, and so on. So this is a company that is replacing those diesel-dependent installations, there's many of them, with renewable power systems, passive solar, passive geothermal, wind, run-of-river hydro, whatever that happens to be. So a very successful company, but facing a whole set of barriers around regulatory restrictions. We're talking now about working with a Federal Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, which has recently been split into two parts, a Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Natural Resources, and each of these has its own bureaucratic rules around funding and investing and co-investing and so on. So for a small company like ACCI, the system that exists now is not calibrated or geared to enabling them to scale up. So investing in this company is also about investing in the potential to expand this kind of work really at the pace at which we need it, which is around the transition to a low carbon economy that is inclusive of people's need for economic reconciliation, as was mentioned by Arlene. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just take a closer look at ACCI Energy's work. There are significant greenhouse gas reductions achievable through the installation of these renewable microgrids. Obviously, tremendous social benefits, job training. These are good, well-paying jobs in communities where typically the unemployment rate is 80 or 90%. So investing in these communities this way creates economic opportunity that's sustained and generates revenues to the community in which can be reinvested in community infrastructure, social enterprise development, and so on. So if we go to the next slide, please. Now if we pull back, we're talking here about the creation of a social or solutions finance fund that would do this kind of work at scale. So if you look on the left, you see the involvement of multiple sectors, including philanthropy, government, private, and corporate funding. And endowments refers to those pools of capital that are currently in either pension funds or university endowments. In some cases, there are land and resource trusts controlled by Indigenous people themselves. And the idea is to integrate those, to apply those capital pools using the financial tools that are outlined in the second column, doing financing social R&D, operating challenge platforms, outcomes funds, which repay investors based on achieving certain measurable outcomes, the ability to build hybrid capital stacks that integrate philanthropic grant making with loan guarantees, patient capital investments, and so on, and an emerging opportunity around what we could call social economy ethical derivatives, or seeds. So if we take an asset like social housing, and not to get too far into this direction with the asset-backed problems that paper issues that surfaced that caused the big financial crisis in 2008, it is still possible to develop ethical derivatives that enable the refinancing of interventions such as we're talking about here with ACCI Energy around renewable energy systems. Loan guarantees, another area that we can provide capital to social entrepreneurs at favorable rates. So a suite of tools. If we move over to the next slide, new approaches. Sorry, just if we can go back a slide, I meant to the next column. New approaches are really, I think, called for now, and we want to just talk about the opportunity to develop hybrid structures that integrate public, private, and community sector assets and perspectives on things like community interest corporations that can invest according to a charter, a company charter, with the profits to go back in the majority to the community and community-run enterprises. So this is another area, I think, for exploration. We'd love to hear more about such approaches being taken in other parts of the world. And this kind of mechanism allows us to address a variety of complex issues. If you look at the bottom, social innovation labs, open data and technology, and centers for useful evidence, or what work centers. Together, we think, form an ecosystem for systemic change. And so we're talking not just about a fund here, but about the other parts of social infrastructure where smart investments can create good learning and good opportunities to accelerate transition. How do we take account of the positive externalities that these kinds of investments make and integrate those into financial models? We're taking this particular approach of creating a social finance fund to the federal government, who have initiated a steering committee on social innovation and social finance. We're excited about the potential for that to create a multi-$100-million fund to do this kind of work. We're also working with the Senate in Canada to engage politicians around this. And I hope that by the time we meet in November, that we'll be able to report on some significant progress in this direction. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we bring this back to the ACCI energy issue, if we have this kind of funding available, this kind of social innovation labs, the open data, the evidence centers, it should be possible to scale up the impact of companies like this in collaboration with companies like Suncor, with governments, and to accelerate that shift, taking account of the fact that we want to transition to a low carbon economy while also addressing the social economic needs of the most vulnerable citizens in Canada. And I think this addresses the issue that Bruce is raising about how do we do this without generating a populist backlash. So creating opportunities for inclusive growth, I think, is really the central challenge that we're facing in order to effectively transition to a low carbon economy. We're really looking forward to hearing from other people's experience about this kind of work and engaging with you in further learning and discovery. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. I want to open the conversation to questions among the panel, and then we'll open it to our colleagues who are listening in. One of the things that struck me, again, is that you're each bringing unique skills and talents to the table from your vantage point, and you're using finance to achieve social change. When you started this relationship, how did that come about? How did you start working together? What was the motivation? What drove you to create change? And what have been the challenges that you faced as you're navigating a collaboration around climate change and social finance? So I'm going to open it up to Arlene, Stephen, and Bruce to answer that question. How'd you do it? Why'd you do it? And what relevance does it have for the world?
Well, I think one of the things that I would start with is, is this kind of a collaboration for us reflects our values and our commitment to sustainable development. So these folks that we've been collaborating with have demonstrated a willingness to join us in the solution space. And frankly, it's been a long-term relationship. I think that's one of the things that we have found is that when you're working in the collaboration space, it takes a trusting relationship. It doesn't happen overnight. We've found that you need to be committed to that long term. And for us, we're actually proud of the fact that this kind of a commitment is reflected in our values. It crosses CEOs and people that come and go. This is who Suncor is and what we believe in. And then our experience working together has showed us that we can look at where we have common interests and what it is that we're trying to achieve together. And I think I hope it's okay if I speak for all of us when I say that we've demonstrated some courage, because sometimes you get criticisms from your colleagues, whether it's in industry or it's about making change, and that change occurs internally in our organization and externally. So those are a few of the things that we've learned as we've partnered together.
That's fantastic. Stephen?
Yeah, I just maybe build on that a little bit to say that it's certainly the case, I think, for each of us that we've faced criticism from people within our sector, whichever sector we happen to be involved in, that we're collaborating with the enemy, or that we're somehow compromising our position when we engage with, in our case, a large energy company. Having said that, we just could not imagine succeeding at the scale that we need to with the innovation and the commitment that we can all bring to this together. It's really the only way to move forward, in our view, is to work collaboratively. And Suncor has been, for us, not only a loyal partner. There's been times when they've stood up on behalf of our right to speak truth to power. When it was difficult in Canada for a while to express an opinion against the tar sands or pipelines or whatever. And Suncor was quite forward in saying, no, actually, we need all voices at the table here. This is a democracy, and it's important to have a diversity of views. So, in that sense, I think it's such an important collaboration for us. The fact that we're able to work together on the Fiscal Commission. I would also highlight Suncor's presence in the Indigenous communities of Canada, particularly in the West. That's a very strong social concern for foundations like ours. And the ability to have the conversation about energy and social justice at the same time seems like a critical nexus point for the kind of change that we're looking for.
Bruce, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I agree completely with Stephen and Arlene. And I think I guess there's two things from my perspective that make this critical. One is the philanthropic resources available in Canada to tackle these complex issues are minuscule relative to the problem. And if we don't start putting our resources collectively together around common solutions and then figure out how to leverage more private and public, as in government resources, we're simply not going to get the job done. And then finally, the other piece that's I think critical is really around scale. And Gayle, you and I have talked a lot about going to scale, which is I think one of the great challenges for philanthropy. It's very easy for us to fund and support a small initiative and see the great success that happens at a local level. But how do you go to scale in shifting the entire resource economy of a nation? And if we don't have those corporate partners who actually are the ones that are driving the resource economy, then we're simply not going to get the scale that we require.
And I think that raises a good point, Bruce, which is going to scale in finance. We're talking about the Oxford Social Finance looks at blended capital. How do you build partnerships? How do you bring in new resources, financial resources specifically? When you think about other partners at the table, specifically the finance industry, the finance sector, where are they in those relationships? And Stephen, you've talked about the Social Finance Fund. Again, how are you bringing in traditional finance organizations to help go take this initiative to scale? What new products are you offering? What kind of new financial incentives are you using to, again, shift a nation and create a different kind of economy going forward that's supportive of the environment and sustainable? So where's finance?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. So, I think around the world we're seeing the emergence of solutions finance or social finance and impact investing as critical catalysts and levers for bringing about the kind of work, the kind of change and transition that we're talking about. Here in Canada, we've got a history that's partly about the cooperative movement and mutuals, people putting money into financial institutions that reflect community priorities as opposed to simple bottom line returns. But we're now at a moment where this field is ready to expand rapidly. The work of the G7 task force on impact investing is important here, and we're in ongoing discussions with people there about growing this marketplace. Big Society Capital and similar institutions around the world are beginning to put capital at work in creating social and environmental impact. Even that, though, is not sufficient to the scale that Bruce was talking about and that we need. And so if we look at the role of philanthropy, as tiny as we are, we're nonetheless able to de-risk certain kinds of situations, to take first positions. We participate, for example, we have a loan guarantee program that enables environmental and other organizations to build as close to zero carbon buildings as possible. So providing a loan guarantee, lowering the interest rate on an investment by a group of not-for-profit organizations is one way that we can leverage our own assets. But we're really now at the point where, again, scale has to be our biggest concern and the biggest opportunity. The people that we talk to in pension funds, in financial institutions now, are asking questions of us and people who we work with that they just haven't asked before. I think we're very close to seeing a significant increase in funds directed to the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, and in the public sector's participation in this space, coming in as a patient investor or catalytic investor, building on philanthropy's commitments and leveraging in larger scale investments from the private sector.
Fantastic. Arlene, Bruce, any other comments? How are your partners? Yeah.
I'll add just a couple. One of the things that we're doing, and this is, appreciating the comments that Stephen made about scale. This is small in the context of the challenge and the solutions that we're working on. But on the collaborative theme, one of the things we have done is collaborated with the BC Clean Tech CEO Alliance and another energy company, Synovus, on a $100 million venture capital funding initiative out of BC for clean tech initiatives, and really providing that seed capital to help get these things going. So that's one example. Another is we're bringing together right now just to work with governments and universities and other companies, an organization called Clean Resource Innovation Network, where we're really trying to say, let's work together on best allocation of capital so that we're taking advantage of the opportunities to lower our own carbon footprint and right across the energy sector. So, I mean, the collaboration theme for us is really important as we leverage scarce funds. It becomes more important than ever that we're working together on these initiatives.
So I'm going to shift now into asking some of the questions from our participants. Shiva Patel has asked a couple questions. Can a low carbon economy really achieve the necessary social and environmental goals? What are the fundamental transitions in how capitalism operates? To what extent is our current model of capitalism the source of climate issues versus fossil fuels alone? And what are your organizations addressing? How are your organizations addressing deeper systemic issues? So 4 in 1. So Stephen?
Thanks. Great set of questions. And I think this goes to the notion of scale, not only as scaling up and getting bigger, but also scaling deep in terms of the values shift or the cultural shift that we have to consider is part of the context and part of what has to be in focus for us. I would say from the outset, at the beginning, that working with Indigenous people at a direct and sustained level is an important contributor to those conversations. Indigenous people have been around for 10,000 years at least on this continent and bring additional perspective and depth to some of these questions. I think this is also a time when, if we're talking about capitalism and where it's going, we're at a period when sort of 20th century cowboy capitalism, if we can call it that, or 19th century or earlier, has to be reinvented. And this means taking account of externalities. And it actually opens up a pretty interesting, exciting space for financial innovation. And so thinking of things like we've invested recently in a crowdsourced or crowd-funded platform for doing solar power installations. We look at the opportunities the biggest opportunity that Canada faces to reduce greenhouse gas emissions the most quickly is actually in energy retrofits. Rather than, it's 15 to 30% the cost of doing new renewable installations. So in the energy retrofit business, we've got an opportunity to hire thousands and thousands of people to do those things. There's a program we're involved in called Tower Renewal that is retrofitting residential towers. We have forests of them in our cities, and they're extremely energy inefficient, the ones at least that were built in the 60s and 70s. So working with cities to rezone territory around these buildings, to allow people to run enterprises from within them, reducing transit costs and so on. There's a whole, I think, a whole space emerging around this work where social finance and social innovation can work together to at least let us look at more alternatives and ways to move forward. So great question, thank you.
Great. Bruce?
Yeah, those are fundamental questions, I think, that we all ask ourselves, and one of the great challenges that we face. And I guess our approach is that there's really two things happening at the same time. One is, how do we shift in a relatively incremental way this big, as I was describing, this big complex ship where capitalism and strong vested resource interests have been the dominant sort of mover, while at the same time recognizing that we need fundamentally new ways of thinking about the future. And we need to look at, which is the focus that I've been describing in our work, is what kinds of new institutions do we need to create that actually think this through? How do we shift our big finance sector players? How do we shift the government, our government's own financing, whether it's of infrastructure or even rules within the finance sector? So I think absolutely the way that capitalism functions is a fundamental challenge. But we have to balance that as well with the fact that most of the people who are making the decisions in this country are very firmly supportive of capitalism. So it is that tension that I think we're all trying to deal with, and I think it's going to be a constant tension for us.
And Arlene, I want you to answer that set of questions, but also there was a specific question to Suncor, which is, again, what is, as we think about how are you taking responsibility, meaning the Suncor, in your role in climate and in your company's plans to draw down fossil fuel-based business and transition to a clean energy economy? So controversy and open conversation is what this is about. So I'd love to have you respond to that.
Sure, thanks, Gayle. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important when you think about Suncor's business strategy is that we are making investments in the operation of our business for long term. Like, we actually are looking longer. We have the privilege and the challenge of being to look a long term out. Our capital that we invest in operating in the oil sands is less like an exploration of new wells where you draw down on the reserves quite quickly, and more like a manufacturing business where you invest your capital in it and it then can last for some time. So as we think about our role, that's where we know we have to continue to invest in technology and innovation, because the interest at play here is emissions. And we're looking at lowering our carbon footprint. And we know that if we're going to be relevant in a transition to a low carbon economy, what we need to be is globally carbon competitive and globally cost competitive. And then we think we can play a long-term role in that. I mean, from a foundation point of view, I also want to make the point that we see our role as, we can't do it alone. And I feel like I'm harping on this collaboration, but we really take our role as convener seriously. So we have made investments in things like, a multi-million-dollar investment in the Energy Futures Lab, which was bringing people together, both from the environmental community, from government, from multiple industries, including the renewable sector, about what does our energy future look like in Alberta. And frankly, that was a tough decision for us, because you lose control of what the answers and the recommendations are going to be. But again, we think that's an important facilitation, and that convening role that we can play is an important way that we can have an impact on that, the challenge for Canada. How do we transition to that low carbon economy?
And I think that's fantastic. Thank you for those responses. Again, this kind of debate in conversation is what Oxford Social Finance is about. How do we deal with the most pressing issues in the world? How do we do it through collaboration? How do we use different approaches and strategies to actually take something to scale. Now, a couple of other questions have come in that I think are, again, what's the role of government? What's the role of academia? In really helping achieve change. Bruce, you talked about the Fiscal Commission. All of you have supported academic institutions as well as engaged government. So let's spend a few moments on that, and we'll shift it over to Brad. So Stephen, thoughts on role of government and academia in moving forward?
Sure. Well, just with regard to government, I think we're increasingly, certainly at the moment in Canada, finding that our goals and program objectives and so on are aligning quite significantly with federal priorities. Provincially in Canada, we have another set of dynamics, and we're, as a federation, we've got opportunities to work at that level as well to affect change at varying rates, and to demonstrate, by doing so, demonstrate to the rest of the country that certain types of innovation are possible. We look to Alberta, for example, and its leadership on the issues that Arlene's been talking about. We also work municipally with governments now, and partly this is a result of having a federal government that really wasn't paying much attention to these issues. It pushed our attention to the provinces and cities. City governments, I think, are increasingly an increasingly important player in this space. I'd like to talk a little bit about academia and say that this is one of those places in society where the pace of innovation can, I think, be accelerated in terms of how universities engage around these issues. The emergence of the social lab movement globally in government and now in civil society, I think, is important to be tracking. And let's not let universities off the hook in terms of where their assets are invested. I think the movement to de-invest has been interesting, but more importantly, I would say, is the opportunity for universities to proactively invest in solutions. So those university endowments are currently almost 100% invested in the stock market, and that's fine, but the opportunity to participate in the impact investing and social finance marketplace is one for, I think, where leadership is needed, and we'll see that very soon.
We're going to shift just slightly, but I want to keep you with this, again, this tension and opportunities. When we think about scale, and I'm speaking to everyone who's listening in, we begin from the ground up. So building the capacity of social enterprise organizations as well as mainstream finance is all part of the ecosystem. How can we be strategic when we're pulling together these unique partnerships? How do we see the big picture, and how projects like ACI can be supported, how you can take a scale on a provincial level and a national level to deal with the issue of climate change, which impacts us globally. When we think about Canada's footprint in the world, it controls enormous amount of the Arctic Circle, our natural resources, and how Canada shifts into a low carbon economy, given the dependence it has in terms of being an extractive, built its wealth on extractive industries, is a dynamic and a tension that we're going to talk about at Oxford Social Finance Program. And I want to thank our panelists for joining us, and apologize for our technological glitches today. We're on various continents around the world operating, and I want to thank Arlene and Stephen and Bruce for joining us, and to say this is the quality of faculty and colleagues that will be joining us in November for the program. Brad, I want to turn it over to you to talk about Oxford Social Finance Program and how people can participate.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Gayle, for your time today and for hosting our webinar. And I really wanted to thank Bruce, Stephen, and Arlene for their contributions today and their contributions to the program, as we are fortunate to be welcoming 6 executives, 2 from each foundation, to join us this November. So we'll have a healthy contingent of Canadians participating on the program, but also, as Gayle mentioned, teaching on the program, where Bruce, Stephen, and Arlene will be giving you more depth on their discussion today in a case study that they've been responsible for delivering around the topics they've covered today. So a couple, I guess I wanted to cover a couple of things related to the program. So for those of you who have tuned in for the first time, we've been running a successful impact investing program for the last 5 years, and our community has grown to 250 strong on the executive side. To complement our success, and the program's been fully subscribed for the last 3 years, to complement our success and to grow this area out, specifically amongst our research and obviously our applied case studies and research, which puts this into practice and makes it relevant to professionals. We wanted to broaden out the area, which is one of the reasons why we developed a broader social finance program to look at the breadth of the industry, not just in terms of tools, but more importantly in terms of collaboration and leadership. Our social finance program, I guess you could divide it into a number of different sections. We take a look at wicked problems and the deliberate leadership construct. So everything we do is framed within a leadership context, as we see that as the center of coming up with creative and clumsy solutions to some of these global large-scale problems. So there's a strong leadership component. Then we have a number of themes we will be addressing on the program. We'll be looking at themes like today, climate change, innovation, and sustainable finance. We'll be looking at sustainable cities, as that is, and well, it's on the agenda, but it continues to grow and grow in relevance. We'll also be looking at fundamental areas of impact measurements and performance measures. So we'll be looking at the power of feedback, and we'll be welcoming a lady by the name of Faye Tversky from the Ivey Foundation to show what that looks like in practice. But we'll also be looking at areas of technology. We'll be looking at public-private partnerships, the world's first development impact bond. We'll be looking at how important blended capital, but also from a corporate perspective is. So how are Levi Strauss delivering health and worker well-being in their workforce, and the plethora of supply chains they deal with around the world. So there's a number of interesting elements to the program. There's themes, there's social finance tools, there's the leadership question. But then we'll also be looking at layering capital and managing risk. So how do you put different types of social finance together to make it relevant and interesting and also practical to investors? So I really do encourage you to join us for our first program. We are on our way towards being fully subscribed. So we really do encourage you to contact us to follow this up. But we have a healthy registration list. We have a number of professionals, almost 40 of them are currently registered on the program. And you're probably wondering what types of professionals we attract. We typically attract senior executives who have 10 to 15, often more, years of experience in senior leadership roles. But I just want to illustrate that it's a global group. We have at least 20 nationalities from all major continents. But the types of organizations who will be joining us, we have our Canadian friends from Raven Capital Partners in BC that will be joining us. We also have professionals from the likes of Standard Chartered Bank, BlackRock, the Minority Business Development Agency in the US, the Rocky Mountain Institute, Northern Trust Asset Management, the International Trade Center, and even NE Social Impact, Impact Investing and Venture Philanthropy Fund from China. So we do have a very diverse group. So I just wanted to stop there. So if you've got any further questions, please do get in contact with myself, Bradford Peaston. You can find my details on the website, or my associate, Hannah Longford, would be happy to have a call and to discuss any of your questions with you related to social finance or our impact investing program. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to potentially meeting a number of you this November in person. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.